regarding safeguarding, do you want it to be, more? I suppose it already is. Do you want people to be talking about it more? Do you want people? Where do you get to the point, I suppose, where parents are also really understanding? Obviously, there's a whole heap of parents, who are in maybe you can argue the luxury or whichever way you want to look at it, and they already understand safeguarding, and they obviously are protecting their children. Vast majority probably of parents are. How do you get to those parents who don't fully don't necessarily understand it enough, and basically, their reliance is purely on the school in some ways. It's a little bit like the social care element of it all. It's all like, well, once my kid's out the door, I don't need to really think about them.
Yeah, it is a really important aspect of supporting young people. So what about the family? What about the responsible adults in their life?
Yep.
And it's really interesting to contextualise that for people, because they will see risk potentially through social media or whatever. They've seen something on TV, so they know that there can be online threats. But actually, do they then think about things like, so where's my youngster going for a music lesson or football coaching? Or so a lot of the work we do is in sectors where children go. So it could be in faith settings, it could be in sports clubs, all the places that children go.
Yeah.
Because actually, people who are paedophiles are incredibly good at grooming the family as much as they are at grooming the child.
Okay.
And it's actually some of those aspects of getting people to think more widely about who are the people that having maybe unsupervised access to their children, or even access in such a way that if you look at some of the stuff that's out there at the moment on Netflix and on the internet about some of these awful cases where children are actually being abused, sometimes in the complete ignorance of their parents, but actually, as a professional, being aware that sometimes the parents could be grooming you as a professional, or a coach could be grooming parents to accept that things that you and I would think are abnormal are normal. So introducing people to some examples of how people have been groomed and abused, because there are some horrific, awful, but real life examples of how athletics coaches have groomed parents. We did a webinar recently with Paul Stewart, ex-Spurs and Man City footballer, who disclosed the abuse towards himself when he was 50 years old, but had been happening systematically during his early teen years at the hands of a football coach who, in the eyes of his parents, was simply trying to make him a world-class professional footballer, ultimately.
Yep.
And he was a victim of awful systematic abuse. But the offender put as much effort into grooming the parents as he did into grooming Paul himself.
Yeah.
And you see this time and again. So it really is, I think with parents, statistics rarely kind of work that well. But I think if you actually can engage them in some real life cases and talk to them about potential risk, then actually getting them to think slightly differently. It's a bit like driving, isn't it? You can drive without thinking there's a risk, or you can actually drive defensively thinking there may be a risk.
Yeah.
You don't have to spend your life walking around under a cloud of depression thinking, oh my goodness me, any moment something bad's going to happen.
Sure.
But what you can do is to be positive about the actions you take to make sure that you minimise the chances of those bad things happening. So, engagement with parents, and of course, this is where COVID-19, I think, has made a difference.
Okay.
because engaging with parents, as schools will find all the time, it will be the same parents that don't attend a parents' evening. It will be the same parents that don't send PE kit, don't send lunch, that don't respond to letters from the school, that actually it will be those parents that will not come to a discussion at the school about online harm to their children, about safeguarding, about drug and alcohol abuse, about safe driving for youngsters when they become 17 and 18. The same parents. But what has happened during COVID-19, and you know, I've witnessed this through personal experience where I'm still involved with schools, but also we've heard it so many times. In fact, we did a debrief. I mentioned that we had 2,000 delegates through our weekly sessions for COVID-19 support. We actually engaged free of charge, because he's a great guy, Professor Jonathan Crago from the Hydra Foundation, to run a structured debrief for us of delegates attending those sessions. And we had 250 delegates on a structured debriefing session, feeding back their experiences of safeguarding during COVID-19. And there was a structured questionnaire so that they were able not only to answer their own questions, but also able to respond to the answers given by other people. And it's an incredibly rich process. I'd previously had that experience in policing of debriefing incidents and events and cases. In fact, the methodology, which starts with immersive training and learning exercises right the way through to debriefing, was a very sad but very positive response to the murder of Stephen Lawrence. That's how the methodology actually first began in improving the investigation of really serious crimes.
Sure.
And we brought that across because actually sometimes, very often, DSLs don't get the chance to talk to each other and share those experiences, and they're learning. So we created this debriefing document and the positive lessons from COVID-19 about the parents that are sometimes hard to reach is that actually, now that they have been providing food parcels to the family from the school, now that they've been fixing maybe broadband access for a family, lending them a laptop or a tablet, the relationships that hadn't been there are being developed now. The real challenge is keeping those relationships going afterwards, and they don't see the school as the opposition, yet another branch of officialdom that's going to cause them a problem, but actually seeing the school as a caring place that is there for them and their children. And I think this is a fundamental shift in the mentality around what education offers in our community, actually. It's not putting somebody in, you know, age 4 or 5, putting them through a machine and bursting them out the other end with the right certificates. And if you haven't got the right certificates, then the school has failed and the individual has failed. That is just so not what modern education is about. You know, education is a community, you know, and it's a representative of all of us, actually, in the raising of the next generation and bringing those people through with their ideas, their innovation, their imagination, their drive, all those great things, and actually using that potential to create change for the better going forward. If we can use safeguarding as actually a method of making that connection with people in a positive way, so they don't see education as something threatening. Oh, you haven't done this, you haven't done that. Oh, I need to see you because, and it's always because it's around misbehaviour or whatever it happens to be. But actually, it's a positive thing because the school is supporting your child, supporting your family, supporting your community. And we flip this on its head when we talk about this, because the other bit of this is about making sure that the school looks outside the fence. Because sometimes there have been examples of schools, you know, if it happens outside the fence, it's not our problem. And I understand where that's coming from. You know, ultimately people teachers and people that work in schools have got to go and have a private life away from work and all that kind of stuff. They're not 24-hour-a-day social workers in the community,
Yep.
That's unpaid, to run people's lives for them. That's not their role. So there has got to be a clear delineation, but the ability to work on a multi-agency basis. Because if I'm seeing stuff in school, maybe about drugs, what do the police know about it? What do the health service know about that? What does social care know about that? What does the local community know about that? And how can we, as a really important part of the fabric of that local community, as a school or a college, how can we then play our part in fixing what's going on? Because whatever is happening outside that fence, you're going to see the symptoms or the outcomes of that inside the fence.
Yeah.
So better to be part of the solution.
I think it's a really good point about COVID as well, because I think, it's generally about society anyway. I think society have reached out with compassion more now with COVID, maybe your elderly neighbour who, doesn't get visits and, people putting parcels out. I think it's actually part of, I'd hope, and I really do hope, is actually something that continues to happen, because actually it is part of the best of us as part of the society. That should continue. Yeah, that's really, really important. I suppose it comes back to the solution as well, because the more we're talking, the more I sort of start thinking about, some of these subjects aren't easy to talk through. They're not easy subjects. It's really, but it is easy to turn around and say, I've got a safeguarding policy. I'm making sure this child attends. I'm taking the attendance and I'm then reacting to that. Or I'm monitoring behaviour and seeing if the aggression goes up, or is bullying happening and that sort of stuff. But that is within the fence, as you say, and actually probably within the fence, there's not much of these other potentially, more some of these subjects that you don't want to talk about, like paedophilia and so on, as much going on within those within those brackets. So there's, and I feel sometimes maybe that's where parents are as well, where they're sort of going, well, actually they're safe in school, so actually I don't need to worry so much. Where actually some of these other subjects which you've been talking about, they do need talking about, because the more that people are aware, as you say, the more they can defend against it. The more they can, more they're aware of what, people like, the guy who was grooming the football player, and also the, same with Crew as well, the Crew Football Club, and that's quite well published. Yeah. The more people understand those traits of those sort of people and the way they work, the better they, you can defend against it and protect your children even more so.
I think it's a really tricky issue, because it's like crime and the fear of crime.
Okay.
It blew me away a few years ago when I was Chief Constable. We did a survey of local people in Dorset and said, right, what's your top issue? Then, is it burglary? Is it car crime? Is it sexual assault? Is it top issue in Dorset, bearing in mind the age profile of the county of Dorset, albeit slightly different in over in Poole and Bournemouth, was cybercrime.
I obviously, as you know, I went to school in Dorset, so when you say that, it makes me do
quite. So we actually had to ask ourselves, why is that? And when you analyse it and you go and ask deeper questions, of course, what you discover is that it affects every age group. So actually, with youngsters, those issues about sexting, online bullying, all those kind of issues, sending images, online grooming, all that stuff. But actually, as you move up the chain, now we're getting phishing emails, and we're getting phone calls at home linked to, log on, I can see that you've got, Microsoft Windows and it's not working properly and all that. Actually, a lot of older people are experiencing that kind of stuff. And what's really fundamental is that's happening in your home. And to your kids, it's happening in their bedroom. So there is a real feeling about, in the old days, if you were bullied in the playground, at least you could go home and be safe.
Yeah.
That feeling has been undermined. So I think when you're talking about some of these topics, for me, quite often, it's about taking a judgment about those things that you actually need to talk about with parents or with youngsters, versus scaring them with every potential possible risk. It's for professionals to worry about those risks and to work out how they're going to handle them.
Yep.
You can give people resilience skills. You can give them coping skills. You can, encourage and grow their resilience. You can, give them advice about how best to use social media applications and so on and so forth. But there does come a point where you have to say, some of the very serious things are actually small in number. And therefore, it's up to the professionals to make sure that they've got very targeted programs and initiatives in place, instead of frightening everybody that this is an ever-present risk in their lives.
Yeah.
And that does require an amount of judgment, but it requires you to know what the heck is going on. And one of the things that, when we started our journey, was the first thing we did wasn't to build some software. It started with my friend and co-founder, Mike Glanville. We were both involved with schools. He was chair of governance of the primary school, going into the school and saying to the head teacher, "Hi, Sarah," name changed to protect the innocent. It happens to be your wife's name, so I thought, "Hi, Sarah, how do we do safeguarding in the school then?" And this is back in 2013. So she pulled open the desk drawer, took out the 4-ring binder, bursting with paper and full of risk. And all of a sudden there was this moment where Mike, with his years of experience in policing, was going, "Oh my Lord." And he came back to the office, he said, "You will never guess." And that really set us on a year of academic research, looking at the law, looking at the guidance, looking at serious case reviews, and actually analysing to a really detailed degree the issues. And we came up with this integrated model for education, for safeguarding. And actually, as it's grown, it applies across every sector that we work with, because it's every part of it, and you've got to kind of draw it on paper to make it live, haven't you? So we've got this kind of 8-point model that kind of says, well, everything starts in an organisation with governance, leadership and management. If any of those 3 things stink, you've got a problem, because things won't happen, and the right things certainly won't happen.
Yep.
Then when you get to safeguarding, the first thing on your agenda actually should be prevention.
Yeah.
Actually, either stopping things happening at all, or to stopping things from escalating when they've started. So actually, are all your efforts pointed towards prevention? Then, how do you record things?
Yep.
So are you actually open to people recording things? Or are you making it so difficult for them because they've got to walk over the far side of the school and ask for a yellow form and whatever it happens to be? So is it actually easy for people to put their hand up and say, "I've got a concern"? Then, how do you case manage? One of the first schools we went to, we went in to see a newly appointed head of school, and we said, so safeguarding then, what are the sort of major issues in safeguarding that you're encountering in your school? Well, in that filing cabinet over there, really? Okay. So what about, how's the relationship with the LADO, the local authority? What's a LADO? So all of a sudden you're starting to think, and of course this guy was relatively new in post, as it turned out, but not only had there been no handover and no training, he had no way of accessing casework, what's current casework. So for us, recording and case management, major issue, and that's got to be right. Then there's this whole piece about working with others. So working with others in your own setting, but working across organisational boundaries, and based on our previous experience and how difficult that can be.
Yep.
So actually, that's really important, learning how to do that and to do it well.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's the whole piece about information management, because you are handling all sorts of data. Most of it is special category data in safeguarding. So if you don't understand the legislation and you don't understand the guidance that tells you when you can share and ought to share information and who with, and when you shouldn't be sharing it with parents and when you should, all those sorts of issues. So information management in itself is huge.
Yep.
So how do you support people who do safeguarding? How do you train them? How do you develop them? How do you judge their competence? How do you, ensure that they know how to work together?
Yep.
And what's expected of them professionally, what their duties are. Then you move on to this whole thing about rich picture. So if it's all locked up in that filing cabinet over there or in that 4-ring binder, what chance have you got of understanding emerging trends, new issues, historical issues, what's affecting a particular child, a particular registration group, year group, school, if you're in a multi-academy trust, what's happening in your different schools, how do you overview that? If it's all in a filing cabinet, you are never going to get that view of the world. And unless the software is properly configured, you're never going to get that view of the world. You're just going to have a recording tool.
Yep.
Finally, for us, lessons learned. How do you learn lessons from your own professional practice and from professional practice elsewhere and embed it in what you do? So that overarching model of safeguarding, for us, describes how the system, going back to systems thinking, ought to operate. And therefore, you can have, as a school, a safeguarding strategy. Your safeguarding prevention strategy actually should address all of those issues.
Yep.
So then when you're looking at prevention, what's in your curriculum that will actually support the resilience of your learners to potential safeguarding issues? Because, let's be fair, the vast majority of those threats are going to come from within the fence, as we talked about, and quite often from their fellow pupils, sadly.
Yeah, that's true.
Because peer-on-peer abuse,
yeah,
sexting, bullying, all those sorts of things,
selling of drugs, all that sort of stuff, yep,
are happening inside the fence, as well as people being able to spot things like female genital mutilation, radicalisation. I mean, mental health is a huge issue. And all that complexity and having to know when you've got to tell the police, because the law tells you you've got to, knowing what action to take. You imagine a peer-on-peer allegation of sexual abuse with 2 students in the same class, one of whom is the alleged victim, one of whom is the alleged perpetrator. And how you actually manage that with those individuals, with their peer group, with their parents. Do you separate them and put them in separate classes? Can you imagine? Well, exactly. And the point is, actually, there are some really tricky issues in there that always haven't got right and wrong answers, but they have got policy decisions to be made in casework.
Yeah.
So unless you've got a proper structure and process in place, it can be immensely problematic for you and cause you all sorts of problems and issues. So you guess, or you try and do the right thing, and then when it turns out to be not the right thing. I was called on one occasion by a local authority safeguarding lead who asked me, knowing my background, to have a chat with a DSL in the school who'd been called to give evidence in the family court. And it was a difficult case. But the DSL arrived at the family court, paper records, several years old. The family are legally represented, the health service are legally represented, social care are legally represented. The only person without any legal representation or support is the designated safeguarding lead from the school, who's just received a summons from the court, get yourself here and bring your records with you. That was a painful and almost career-ending experience for that individual. That's not fair. No. You should never expose people in that way. So some of the things, that we get involved in are preparing people for going to court. Because sadly, if you don't know what it's like, it's a whole new experience, as you can imagine. And there's enough uncertainty without actually not knowing who the different parties are going to be in court, where to stand, the sorts of things that are likely to operate, So there is a huge amount. It's a profession in itself, and unfortunately it's not recognised as such. It's often seen as an add-on to other roles. It's hugely demanding. I've sat in schools showing people the system and literally had people with tears rolling down their face, and I'm thinking, oh my Lord, what have I done? And them actually saying, for the first time ever, somebody understands what we're trying to do and have to do every single day. And I'm walking around with post-it notes, bits of paper. I'm waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning thinking, did I do that? Didn't I do that? We should never be exposing people in that way. It's a hugely important role. And our mission, really is to support those people, because the ultimate aim will be safer children.